In this segment, I'd like us to talk about how we use the code, how we use the code when we look at responsibilities, and how we use the code when when we have to resolve a situation that has ethical dimensions. So, Stephanie, could you walk us through what you see as the process for using
Okay.
the code?
Before I look at the process, I like the metaphor of the code as a compass. It points you in the right direction, but it's not a direct,
Yeah, it doesn't drive the car.
it doesn't
Yeah.
drive the car. It
Right,
just
right.
tells you what roads you might take. So what the code does is help us in examining our core values and our responsibilities to the different parties, and then to weigh and balance and try to come to a wise resolution. There's a tendency, sometimes people want to find an item, there's the answer, I'm done,
Yeah, right,
and get on
right.
with it. And it really is a process of deliberation. So when you have an ethical dilemma, the first thing you want to do is try to identify the problem. So what's going on here? The second thing you want to do is say, is it an ethical problem? Your co-teacher may be putting the paint somewhere that you don't think the paint ought to be housed, but that's not an ethical problem.
Yeah.
That's an issue related to professional practice. So you got to be sure that if it involves ethics, you would be using words like right or wrong or fair or just. So you really want to see what kind of problem do you have. Then you want to say, is it an ethical dilemma or an ethical responsibility? The code has both. When we first wrote it, we focused on the dilemmas, and then later we thought there's a lot of responsibilities here. The primary responsibility to me that we all have to remember is the responsibility to keep confidential information confidential. And that is a characteristic of every profession. We do not expect our doctor to tell other people about our symptoms. We don't expect our lawyer to discuss our financial situation, and we don't expect those who care for children to talk about our family life or our children's disabilities or problems or good or bad behavior. So that is really a primary responsibility. We also have a responsibility never to harm children. And that's not optional. There are dilemmas sometimes that get connected to that, but
The definition of harm.
Yeah. But that's something that if we know it's harmful, we don't do it. That is our responsibility. So there are some things that the code just says you will do, and you just need to know what they are. And you can actually go through the code and pull out what are the responsibilities. Those are the two that I think are most important. If you have ascertained that you have a dilemma, then you need to understand the dilemma. And in a dilemma, you have two possible right answers or two possible wrong answers. But we talk about the horns of a dilemma. So Nancy and I were just talking in a session about the social dilemma of we live in states that have a lot of coastline. And so there's always the conversation about, do you preserve these beautiful, wild, interesting coastlines for people to enjoy the beauty and the tranquility? Or do you develop them and build housing that people need and give people jobs?
Right.
So both of those are right. You want it to be beautiful. You want to preserve the beauty. You want to give people jobs. So now you've got a dilemma. You have two things you've got to weigh and balance. Then when you look at the code, you look at the core values, and that will give you guidance. That just kind of gets you oriented. You look at the guidance in the code, and what's really important for people to know is there's not one answer. The harder the dilemma, the harder it is to come up with the answer, because you really have to think about it, and the code will guide you. You also usually you can't go to one place in the code.
Right.
You've got to look at the ideals and say, well, who do we want to be? You've got to look at the principles and say, what do we have to do? And you may need to look at the sections about families, the sections about community and society. So you really need to use your code. And one of the things that someone said early on was that it would be good to see codes of ethics that are well used and
Yeah, right,
smudged,
right,
and
right.
that shows you that people are actually using it as a
Right,
resource
right,
rather
right.
than
the dog-eared code is
the
what we're trying-
dog-eared code is
that's
what we're
going
after.
for. Yeah.
So you got to process all this stuff. And then you say, the next step, and we're very good at this in early childhood, can we find a solution that will make everybody happy?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about that when we talk about cases. And we call this is a term we learned early on that I like, we call it ethical finesse.
Mm-hmm.
Can we find a way to deal with this without having to come to a hard decision where somebody's gonna be unhappy or disappointed or in some way feel hurt by it.
Right.
So that's finesse. Then you can't do finesse. You tried everything, it doesn't work. How do we prioritize our values? Then you have to start to say, well, let's look carefully and who do we have the responsibilities to? What does the code say? How do we prioritize these things? Then, after you've processed it, and the harder the dilemma, the harder it is to do this. And at some point you say, I think this is the best resolution that I can come up with at this time. We never use the word solve.
Right.
We resolve.
Right.
And a resolution may be temporary. It may change at another time.
And you use your best professional judgment.
And you
to arrive there.
absolutely use your best professional judgment. And again, some things are obvious. It's never okay to gossip. You just don't do it. But some things, and we'll talk about some of them, are much harder. And then you have to take all the guidance you can, and then you bring, sometimes you want to consult with a colleague you respect, but ultimately you have to go to your best and wisest self, and sometimes it's a really hard decision to make.
Yeah.